The sun had barely touched the horizon, yet the New Mexico plains already burned with a harsh, copper glare. Silas Boone squinted through the heat shimmer, his boots crunching dry earth, heart hammering like the hooves of a runaway horse. Something was wrong. He didn't have to see it to know, Dusty wasn't in the corral. The gate hung wide, swaying as if mocking him. Not today, he muttered under his breath, chest tightening. Not after everything. 3 years of solitude had taught him to read the land, the wind, the slightest sign of movement. And right now, every instinct screamed that the gelding, his last tether to life after June's fevered death, was gone. He dropped the coil of wire from his hands, the metal clanging hollow against the post. His palms ached, scratched by splinters. Dusty's tracks led into the brush, fading where hard-packed soil swallowed them whole. He cursed low, bitterly. It wasn't coyotes, not this time. Something else had spooked him, or stolen him. Silas scanned the ridges, scanning the horizon for shadowed shapes, for any hint of a rider. Nothing moved. The only sound was the whisper of the wind through mesquite and sagebrush, and the distant call of a hawk. Silas slumped against the corral post, jaw tight, staring at the empty space where Dusty should have been. The bay had carried him through every harsh season, every lonely night, hauling logs, carrying him to town, even standing by him when the dark memories of June's grave crept too close. Losing Dusty wasn't just losing a horse, it was losing the last piece of himself that had survived grief. Night fell like a velvet curtain, dark and oppressive. Silas paced the cabin yard, rifle slung over his shoulder, lantern light dancing across weathered pine walls. Every sound made him jump, the brush shifting, a rodent scurrying, the ghost of a coyote's howl. He imagined Dusty beaten in some gully, dragged by strangers, or running wild until exhaustion claimed him. The thought clawed at his gut. He forced himself to sit, to breathe, but sleep was a stranger. Memories of June's fever, the helplessness of her last breaths, the hollow cabin in Texas, they all surged forward like a stampede. Silas pressed his palms to his face, feeling the grit of dust and sweat, trying to steady the storm inside. He swore under his breath he wouldn't let Dusty go without a fight, not while there was still a breath in his lungs. Midnight stretched long, each hour heavier than the last. He returned outside, coat tight against the chill, eyes straining through the dark. The gate creaked as he checked the latch again, his hands shook, not from cold, but from the fear that gripped tighter than any bandit's grip could. Dusty had always been steady, sure-footed, and loyal. The absence of his familiar presence twisted something deep in Silas's chest. Hours dragged on. He moved from window to porch, from bedroll to floor, listening, imagining, praying the wind carried word that Dusty was safe. The silence mocked him. Then, before dawn, a sound broke the hush, faint, uneven, deliberate. Hooves striking earth, soft but urgent. Silas froze, every nerve taut. Dusty. Relief surged, sharp and bitter, coiling in his stomach. He stepped onto the porch, rifle ready, eyes straining through gray light. Through the pale morning haze, Dusty appeared, back glistening with sweat, mane tangled, side streaked with foam. The gelding's head was low, breath coming fast, yet steady in his familiar calm. Silas exhaled, hand trembling as he ran a rough palm along Dusty's neck. "You came back, you always do." But relief only lingered briefly, replaced by a sharper tension he hadn't expected. Something, or someone, rode Dusty. A figure, hunched and quiet, hair tangled and dark. Raven. Barefoot, torn dress clinging to her, bruises dark along her arms. Silas's heart skipped, caught between fear and a flicker of awe. She didn't scream, didn't plead. She simply held her ground, eyes steady, chest rising with ragged breaths. Silas's jaw tightened. This was no ordinary night. This was no ordinary horse returning. Dusty had brought more than himself back. And in that heartbeat, standing on the edge of the vast, unrelenting plains, Silas Boone realized, his life was about to change forever. Silas Boone's eyes didn't leave the figure perched on Dusty's back. Raven, barefoot, bruised, her torn dress clinging to her, sat there like she belonged to some other, wilder world than his own. He gripped the Henry rifle tighter, the weight in his hands grounding him, yet it did little to steady the whirlwind in his chest. The horse's hooves hissed against the dirt as Dusty stopped in the yard, blowing out hot, wet breaths. Raven didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She simply let the horse settle, her dark eyes scanning Silas's face with quiet wariness. Silas's first instinct was to demand answers. "Who are you? How did you find my horse?" But the words stuck in his throat. Fear and exhaustion radiated off her in waves he couldn't ignore. Every inch of her told a story of struggle, of running, of surviving where most would have faltered. The gelding shifted, lowering his head toward the trough. Silas gestured with a flat hand. "Water's over there," he said, voice even. Raven hesitated, then guided Dusty forward, fingers trembling slightly as she tilted the bucket. The horse drank first, her hands cupping the water with delicate care before she took a sip herself, spilling it down her wrists. That small act told Silas more than words ever could. She wasn't a thief, not in the way strangers sometimes were. No one who cared for themselves would care for another creature first. She was cautious, sure, but not cruel, not greedy, not weak. He lowered the rifle, leaning it against the porch post, though his muscles remained coiled with tension. He watched her stand there, shoulders squared despite every mark of hardship etched across her body. A patch of her dress hung loose, exposing bruised skin. He looked away, the sight sharp and painful in a way he hadn't felt in years. Silas's mind raced. He could send her away into the scrub, let her fend for herself. He could ride into town, hand her over, and leave the decisions to others. But something about the steadiness in her gaze, the calm acceptance, made both options feel wrong. "All right," he finally muttered, voice low but steady. "You can stay, for now." Her eyes lifted just enough to meet his. Relief flickered there, faint, but unmistakable. Raven didn't speak, didn't thank him. She simply lowered herself to the step near the trough, wrapping her arms around her knees. Dusty shifted slightly, the horse's calm demeanor reassuring both of them. Silas stepped closer, taking in the signs of her journey, the dirt ground into her skin, the marks along her arms. He didn't ask about the pain, didn't voice the questions pressing at his mind. Instead, he moved quietly, gesturing toward the cabin. "Inside," he said. She rose, careful, legs trembling just enough to betray fatigue. Silas led the way, rifle still within reach, eyes scanning the horizon even as he passed the doorway. Inside, the cabin smelled of smoke, ash, and the faint lingering scent of beans. It was plain, narrow, and empty of the companionship it once held. Silas handed her a tin cup of water, set a small plate of bread and beans before her. Raven ate cautiously, hungrily, but not carelessly. Her fingers trembled slightly around the fork, yet each bite was deliberate, like a soldier learning to trust again after a long battle. The hours stretched on with silence mostly, punctuated by small movements, the crackle of the fire, the scrape of chair legs on wood, the occasional shift of Dusty outside. Silas watched her closely, feeling something he hadn't in years, the faint stirrings of hope, of responsibility, of connection. By the time the pale morning light crept through the shutters, he knew one thing: Dusty hadn't returned alone. Raven had chosen to come with him, whether by fate, by chance, or by the horse's quiet guidance. And Silas Boone, solitary cowboy of the high plains, realized his life had just grown wider, more dangerous, and immeasurably richer, all at once. The sun had climbed high over the scrubby plains, painting the land in sharp, golden light. Dusty stood quietly in the shade of a lone mesquite, ears twitching as Silas Boone moved about the cabin yard. Raven followed closely, her bare feet now wrapped in the cracked boots he had set out, blankets still draped around her shoulders. "First thing," Silas said, voice low, "we keep the water fresh. Horse drinks first." He handed her a bucket, showing her the proper tilt, the care needed to avoid spillage. Raven mimicked him carefully, small hands steady but determined. Each movement told him she wasn't just surviving, she was learning, adapting. Silas watched her braid strips of cloth into twine, a skill she must have picked up on the run. "You got patience," he said, a hint of a smile breaking the usual stern lines of his face. Raven's eyes flicked toward him, silent acknowledgement, and then she returned to her task, lips pressed thin, shoulders squared. They moved through the chores of the day almost wordlessly. Raven swept ash from the stove, fetched water, carried feed in small buckets, and patched her torn dress with careful stitches. Silas repaired a broken rail in the corral, guiding her hands when she needed, stepping back when she insisted on trying herself. Each task was a lesson, a bridge between the wilderness she had fled and the home she was beginning to inhabit. At midday, the sun baking the plains, Silas led Dusty into the shade. Raven reached forward, stroking the gelding's mane with slow, deliberate fingers. Dusty shifted slightly, then settled, the animal's calm acceptance a silent confirmation of trust. Silas's jaw loosened just enough to feel it, this was no ordinary moment. It was quiet, but it carried the weight of something stronger than fear, connection. They returned to the cabin for a simple meal. Raven ate carefully, picking at the bread and beans, watching Silas from the corner of her eye. There was still wariness there, a shadow of the miles she'd traveled, of the dangers she'd survived. Silas didn't push. He simply tended to the fire, poured water into her cup, and let the silence fill the space between them. The afternoon brought more work. Fences needed mending, wood needed splitting. Silas showed her the rhythm of the axe, the proper swing, the leverage needed to split even seasoned logs. She tried, muscles straining, bruises darkening under the fabric of her sleeves, and each misstrike brought a shake of frustration. Silas only guided her gently, steadying her hands when she faltered, letting her learn through effort rather than telling her how it should be done. By late afternoon, the wind rose across the plain, carrying with it the scent of dust and distant rain. Raven paused, looking out across the horizon, eyes dark and alert. Silas noticed the tension in her shoulders, the slight tightening of her jaw. He didn't ask, he only placed a hand lightly on the back of Dusty, feeling the pulse of the horse beneath him. Together, the three of them, man, woman, and animal, formed a fragile rhythm, moving through the land in quiet, deliberate harmony. As evening settled, the sky flushed deep orange and crimson, Raven tended the stove while Silas checked the corral one last time. Each glance they shared carried more than words, trust, tentative understanding, the beginnings of something neither had dared name. The plains stretched endlessly around them, harsh and unyielding, yet within the small circle of cabin, firelight, and Dusty, there was safety. There was order. There was the faint, electric spark of life returning. For the first time since Dusty had returned with her on his back, Raven and Silas moved through a day together not as strangers, not merely as survivors, but as companions, learning, teaching, and silently discovering that perhaps, even in the unforgiving West, trust could grow where fear had once ruled. The fire had burned low when Silas Boone finally lowered himself into the worn chair by the door, elbows resting on knees. Dusty shifted in the corral, flanks heaving in the evening heat, while Raven sat near the stove, blanket wrapped tight, fingers tracing the folds absently. The silence stretched between them, heavy but no longer uncomfortable. Name. Silas's voice was rough, low, carrying the kind of weight that only years on the plains could give. Raven lifted her head, dark eyes steady. Her English was halting, clipped, but each word carried intent. Raven. Silas nodded, feeling the single word echo through the cabin. Raven. It was sharp, fitting, wild in its simplicity. He waited a beat before adding, voice softer this time, Silas. Her lips shaped the sound, slow and careful. Silas. The repetition hung in the air, tethering them to the moment, to each other, without need for explanation. For the first time, names passed between them, not just labels, but acknowledgement of presence, of humanity. They moved into the night in quiet rhythm. Silas split the last of the wood for the stove while Raven braided her hair loosely, strands of black falling over her shoulders. Each glance carried a weight unspoken, a recognition of survival and the faint stirrings of trust. The firelight caught the curve of her cheek, the slope of her shoulder, and Silas felt the tight knot of years' loneliness ease just a fraction. She looked up, eyes meeting his briefly. No words, just presence. Silas understood. No need to speak yet. The air was heavy with unvoiced questions. Where had she come from? Who might follow? What dangers lingered beyond the hills? But tonight, for this brief stretch of time, they had only the cabin, the fire, and Dusty. Silas poured a small cup of water and pushed it across the floor toward her. She accepted it with a small nod, cupping it carefully, watching him over the rim. He saw the dark bruises along her wrists, uneven and raw, and he turned away, chest tightening. No questions yet. Not tonight. The hours stretched on, filled with the small movements of two people learning to coexist, Raven mending her dress, Silas checking the rifle, Dusty shifting in the corral. Each act carried a silent acknowledgement, a shared understanding that safety and trust were fragile but possible. Finally, Raven broke the quiet. "You, good man," she said, voice low, halting, but firm. Silas felt a jolt. The words weren't a plea, not a request, but a quiet observation, almost a judgment, and yet carried relief. He nodded once, flat, honest. "And you, strong," he replied, meaning more than the physical. She had endured more than most, survived more than he had seen in years. The fire crackled, sending sparks dancing against the cabin walls. Outside, the plains were quiet, the wind having died down to a gentle rustle through sage and mesquite. Inside, the small circle of warmth felt like a fragile fortress, holding off the weight of the wild beyond. Silas leaned back, eyes catching the glow on her hair. For the first time since June's death, he allowed himself to feel the faint pull of something beyond duty or survival. Connection. Trust. Maybe even the stirrings of hope. Raven tucked her legs beneath her, blanket pulled tight, glancing occasionally at him with steady, dark eyes. The rhythm of the cabin, the fire, Dusty's low shifting, their quiet breathing, was no longer empty. It was shared. Solid. Waiting to grow into something stronger. As the embers dimmed, Silas Boone realized that survival alone had never been enough. Raven's presence challenged that isolation, made it possible to think beyond the solitary grind of land and livestock. And though the night held shadows of danger and the past, for now, in the quiet warmth of the cabin, trust had begun to take root. Tomorrow, they would work the land together again. Tomorrow, the plains would stretch wide and unforgiving. But tonight, names had been exchanged, walls had eased, and Silas knew one thing with certainty: the life he'd thought lost could be rebuilt, one careful step at a time. The wind had shifted, carrying a dry, acrid scent across the plains. Silas Boone's eyes, sharp and unyielding, scanned the horizon. Something was out there, he could feel it in the tightening of his jaw, the way Dusty's ears twitched, alert to a distant disturbance. "Raven," he said quietly, voice low, carrying the weight of command and caution. She stepped beside him, blanket draped loosely over her shoulders, dark eyes following his line of sight. Silas didn't need to speak more. They both knew that sound, hoofbeats, faint at first, then growing sharper, deliberate, purposeful. 3 riders crested the distant ridge. The first, lean and hard-eyed, carried the unmistakable air of ownership, arrogance etched into his posture. Behind him were 2 others, steady, patient, waiting for a sign, for a crack in Silas's resolve. Flint, the leader. Hank and Cole, his shadows. Silas's grip on his Henry tightened, muscles coiled like springs. "They're after her," he muttered, more to himself than Raven. Her fingers twitched slightly around the blanket, but she stayed silent, eyes fixed, unwavering. Silas knew she understood. The danger was real, and they had to face it. The riders approached deliberately, slow and calculated. Flint's grin was slick, confident, the kind bred from a lifetime of taking what wasn't offered. "Heard you got a stray, cowboy," Flint called, voice carrying across the yard. "Apache girl." "Ours." Silas's eyes narrowed, every muscle tensing. "She's not yours," he said flatly, Henry leveled, stance wide and steady. His voice carried no hesitation, no room for argument. Flint laughed, a low, grating sound, spitting dirt onto the dry ground. "Don't tell me you're keeping her. You know what folks'll say. We'll let it be, if you don't get in our way." Silas didn't flinch. His gaze slid past the men, toward the doorway where Raven stood, pale but unbroken, blanket still wrapped around her. He could feel the pulse of the land, the wind against his face, Dusty's quiet presence beneath him. "Step 1 foot closer," he said, voice cold, "and you won't leave." The tension was electric, stretched thin across the dry air. Dusty shifted under Silas's touch, calm yet ready, every nerve aligned with his master's. The three riders hesitated, glancing between the cowboy, the horse, and the silent, steady woman in the doorway. Flint's grin faltered slightly. "Not worth dying for," he muttered, reins snapping in his hands. The three men wheeled their horses and disappeared over the ridge, silhouettes shrinking against the endless horizon. Silas lowered his rifle slowly, pulse still racing, but mind clear. He turned toward Raven. She stepped forward, hand lifting to brush against his arm, trembling slightly, her eyes reflecting relief and trust. "You safe?" she whispered, voice hoarse but steady. Silas shook his head, a faint, grim smile tugging at his lips. "We're safe," he corrected, emphasizing the bond between them. Not just survival, but trust, quiet and hard-earned. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the cabin yard. Inside, the fire glowed red and steady, filling the cabin with warmth. Silas set down the rifle and moved closer, sitting near Raven. For the first time, the silence between them wasn't heavy, it carried the weight of choice, of decision, of protection. She didn't need words, he didn't either. The standoff had passed, but the understanding lingered, they were no longer alone. Silas had claimed the right to defend her, and Raven had chosen to stay. The plains were harsh, the world unforgiving, but together, they had carved out a fragile corner of safety, and that was enough. Even as the shadows stretched long and the wind whispered through the mesquite, Silas Boone realized something he hadn't felt in years: responsibility could feel like more than burden, it could feel like life itself. And tonight, that life included Raven. The wind had shifted across the endless plains, carrying dust and the faint scent of dry grass. Silas Boone stood at the edge of the cabin yard, eyes narrowing as he scanned the distant ridges. Something stirred out there, he could feel it in the tightening of his jaw, the way Dusty's ears twitched, the low shift of the gelding's weight. Danger was coming. "Raven," he murmured, voice low but firm. She stepped closer, blanket draped loosely over her shoulders, dark eyes steady. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. The sound of hooves reached them first faintly, then sharper, deliberate, echoing across the scrub. Three riders emerged from the ridge, slow, purposeful. The leader was tall, lean, and hard-eyed, Flint. Behind him, Hank and Cole followed like shadows, watching Silas with the practiced patience of men who took what they wanted without mercy. Flint's voice cut across the plain, smooth and confident. "Heard you've got yourself a stray, cowboy. Apache girl. Ours." Silas leveled his Henry, stance wide, voice flat and unwavering. "She's not yours." Flint laughed, a harsh, grating sound, spitting onto the dirt. "Don't tell me you're keeping her. Folks'll talk. You know the rules. Step aside, or things get messy." Dusty shifted slightly beneath Silas, muscles coiled and ready, the calm tension of a horse that trusted its rider completely. Raven remained near the doorway, face pale but unmoving, shoulders squared despite the fear she could not hide. Silas's gaze didn't waver. "One step closer, and you won't leave," he said. His tone carried no hesitation, no bluff. This was the frontier. Decisions had to be absolute. Lives depended on it. For a long moment, the ridge was silent except for the wind. The riders hesitated, glancing at each other, at the steadfast cowboy, at the woman behind him. Then Flint muttered, almost reluctantly, "Not worth dying for," and snapped his reins. Hank and Cole followed, and the three figures faded back over the ridge, swallowed by the vast, unyielding land. Silas lowered the rifle, pulse still racing, but his mind clear. He turned to Raven. Her hand brushed his arm, fingers trembling slightly. "You safe?" she whispered, voice rough but calm. He shook his head, giving her a faint, grim smile. "We're safe. For now." The words weren't just reassurance, they were a promise. A promise that he would not let the world take her from him, not while he still drew breath. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the yard. Inside the cabin, the fire glowed red, casting flickering light across walls that had witnessed too much silence. Silas set down the rifle and moved closer to Raven, sitting near her. The silence between them wasn't heavy tonight, it was full of choices made, trust earned, and a bond forged in the heat of danger. Outside, the plains stretched empty and unyielding. Inside, the cabin held warmth, light, and a fragile sense of security. Silas knew that tomorrow would bring more work, more uncertainty, perhaps more danger. But tonight, for a few fleeting hours, they had each other, and that was enough. As the fire crackled, Silas's eyes met Raven's. He wondered silently, would these shadows return? Could the wide, wild land ever truly keep them safe? What would you do if you were standing here, alone with someone you had to protect against the unknown? The night held them in its quiet, both aware that the frontier was relentless, but in this small, guarded circle, they had survived the first test together. Trust had been measured in glances, steadiness, and unspoken decisions. And in that moment, Silas Boone understood that protecting Raven wasn't just duty, it was life, and he would not let go.